good morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is about the post-presidential election results of Nigeria's 2025 presidential elections that took place last month on February 25th. Now, with these election results declaring Bola Tinubu as the president-elect, which garnered some protests as well as the filing of lawsuits by Labour as well as PDP, challenging the process that declared Bola Tinubu as the president-elect of Nigeria. There have been some interviews and some, news media's reporting that some religious leaders as well as traditional leaders and some former governors and governors also on TV giving various interviews with regards to this past election. And in the course of these interviews, there were some religious leaders as well as traditional leaders who called for calm and as well as for the Nigerian citizens to accept the results as the will of God. In essence, what they are saying is that, yes, they don't want violence in the streets. They want the people to be calm. But at the same time, they have to accept the results as the will of God. So this election pretty much and its results, as we know today, is because of the will of God. But I beg to differ on this notion that the election results that proclaimed Bola Tinubu as the president-elect was the will of God. You see, this is why I have a problem with most African countries when it comes to using the name God in vain. And this has become part of the norm in most African countries, where we proclaim everything to be the will of God. And as stated in the Bible itself, that thou shalt not use the name of God in vain. But unfortunately, that is what happens in most African countries, where the name God is used in vain in so many aspects of our lives in Africa. But this is another level when you say that the election results of a country came about as it is because it was the will of God for the Nigerian people to elect Bola Tinubu as the president of Nigeria. I beg to differ on that. Bola Tinubu was elected as president of Nigeria not because of the will of God. He was elected to be president of Nigeria because it was the right opportune time for Bola Tinubu to be president of Nigeria. And he took advantage of the squabblings that existed in PDP that enabled Labour to come in and take most of PDP votes. Basically, PDP and Labour were splitting votes. About 2 weeks ago, right after the elections, I did a segment on this election, and I gave my analysis on why Bola Tinubu won this election. And I still stand by it. Because Bola Tinubu won this election not because of the will of God. He won this election because he had the opportunity because of the squabbling and the splitting of votes among the various other political parties, especially PDP, Labour, and NNPP. And that is what gave Bola Tinubu the opportunity to consolidate his votes and his voters staying with him and voting for APC. That's what gave him the opportunity to become the president-elect of Nigeria, but not because of the will of God. And most of these political leaders and religious leaders, as well as these traditional leaders, should stop using God's name in vain, proclaiming that somehow someone wins election has to be the will of God. It wasn't no will of God for him to become president-elect. He won this election because of the opportune time. And he took advantage of the system that gave him the opportunity to win this election. And I stand by my analysis, which I did a couple of weeks ago. And apparently, even if you listen to Atiku Abubakar and Peter Obi themselves, especially Abubakar, he also was alleging that Peter Obi, PDP, alleging that Peter Obi took a lot of votes from PDP, which is true. That's what basically happened. These two main political parties, PDP and Labour, as well as NNPP, were splitting votes among themselves. So that's what happened. So that gave APC the opportunity to consolidate their votes and win this election. And that is what happened. You know, so yes, Bola Tinubu is the president-elect. And I stand by my assessment as well as analysis that he won this election not because of rigging, of anything, but because of the splitting of votes among PDP and Labour as well as NNPP. Now, this notion that a lot of religious leaders and traditional leaders and some various political leaders from various African countries use God as the reasons why sometimes these things happen is very, very ridiculous and very unfortunate. And God's name should not be used in vain like that. So we use election results as the will of God. What about the poverty that exists in our various African countries? What about the level of corruption? What about the diseases, infant mortality rates that our various African countries experience with children? You know what I'm saying? What about lack of hospitals, lack of basic social amenities for our various citizens of various African countries? Are they also the will of God for us to be in that situation? Are we going to attribute all of these poverty, struggling, bad governance, and the level of corruption and thievery that goes on within our governments in our various African countries to the will of God as well? I mean, come on, give me a break. It's about time these religious leaders stop using the name God in vain. And unfortunately, we have been brainwashed into believing these things. So everything that happens in most African countries that goes on here and there is attributed to be the will of God. To the extent that now we are even attributing the election results to the will of God. Give me a break. Give me a break. They attribute religious conflicts. Muslims and Christians fight among themselves, and this one will claim that is the will of God. So everything that happens in Africa has to be the will of God. Death, poverty, people struggling to even feed themselves, hunger. All of that has to be the will of God. I mean, come on. This is the same notion. Unfortunately, this is the same notion that some of our religious leaders have when it comes to the issue of the curse of Ham. Up to this modern day, out of that racist, bigot European writers in the 18th century, using Ham, because Ham is said in the Bible to be the land of Egypt, being the land of Ham, is being attributed to a black people, which happens to be black people at the time of Egypt, which is ancient Egypt. They're using that curse of Ham up to this day as the justification of why black people in Africa are suffering or live in poverty and live in these conditions in Africa. And it's very, very unfortunate. And you still go to most religious institutions in Africa, and they still have these beliefs there. And these things came about because of racist European writers in the 18th century, when they were attributing the slavery, the enslavement of Africans to the Bible, which had it in the Bible, that Ham was cursed by God. And somehow, Egypt being the land of Ham, that happens to be Africans. So that is why Africans deserve to be enslaved. That is why Africans are in this condition. That is why black people have to be in this poverty and all of that stuff. So to justify slavery, they have to use that Bible of the curse of Ham. And up to this day, you go to some institutions in Africa, religious institutions, and these idiots still believe in that nonsense, that racist bigot notion that was concocted by these 18th century European writers. And some of these religious leaders still believe in that. And out of that, there are a lot of Africans that still believe in this notion that somehow the reason why we live in these conditions because of poverty, because of hunger and all that stuff has to be attributed to that. I mean, give me a break. Give me a break. And there's no even historical facts in the Bible that had anything to do with that in terms of the curse of Ham with black people. Yes, Egypt is in Africa. Yes, Egypt was the land of black people. But what has that got to do? But that is the same notion. So when you have religious leaders in your various African countries who still tend to believe in that racist notion concocted by 18th century European writers, I'm not surprised that you have elections in a country like Nigeria, and then you're going to have traditional leaders and religious leaders also attributing the election results to the will of God. Because they believe in that, because they use that notion to justify why things have to be the way they are, the status quo. So we have to accept things just because this is coming to us because, oh, it's God's will that we have to be in this condition. It's God's will that we have to be poor. It's God's will that we have to be enslaved. Because in the Bible, it says that the curse of Ham, when Ham saw Noah naked and all that stuff, so that means, oh, it's God's will. That is why we are in this condition. My fellow brothers and sisters, don't buy into that false notions. Don't buy into that stupidity. The reason why we have issues in our various African countries is because of our own doings. That has nothing to do with God. Nigeria's election, the choice of the Nigerian people to elect Bola Tinubu as their president-elect was not God's will. It was the opportune time for him, and he took advantage of the squabblings that was going on between PDP and Labour. And that is what he did. He took advantage of that, consolidated his base, and won this election. So he won this election because of that. He did not win this election because it was God's will for him to be elected as president of Nigeria. I'm sorry. I mean, hold on. If Bola Tinubu was chosen by God to lead Nigeria, I'm sorry. If God had to choose somebody to lead Nigeria, it would never have been Bola Tinubu. Please, give me a break. So let's take that stupid notion out of the way. Now, there was an interview that I came across with regards to some of these notions that have been going on about some of these leaders preaching for calm and all that stuff. And in that interview, I had Peter Obi, who was also asked about this situation, and he gave a very eloquent response to it. As a matter of fact, he rebuked him. And I really appreciated the way he was able to stand firm and rebuke this stupid notion of that the election results was because of God's will. You know, and he stood firm on that ground. And the reason why he stood firm, because he's an honest person, and he's not going to kowtow to religious leaders or traditional leaders in Nigeria just because when they say something and they are wrong, he should not say anything about what they have said. But he stood firm and said that what they are saying is wrong. And he's still going to go forward and use the legal system, you know, file the lawsuits and let the legal system work its way out. So at the end of the day, he's not challenging. And I mean, that's one good thing he said also, that he is not challenging the declaration of Bola Tinubu as the president-elect. But rather, he's challenging the process, which is a very good thing. Because at the end of the day, we want to see a fair process. So whatever went wrong that they believe might have caused the Electoral Commission in delaying pronouncing the results and all that stuff, all those things will come to light. And then they'll have to make amends to it. So at next elections, the people of Nigeria wouldn't have to go through this again. So he himself said it. Peter Obi said it himself in one of the interviews I saw, that he's not challenging them declaring Bola Tinubu, even though he thinks he won the election, but he's not challenging the Electoral Commission declaring him, but he's challenging the process by which they used to get to that conclusion. You know what I'm saying? So I applaud him for that. And he also came up with some good plans in that interview. And out of that, I came to my own senses and to my own conclusion that Nigeria really lost this election. This election was lost by the Nigerian citizens. This election was not lost by Peter Obi or Atiku Abubakar or anybody else. But the Nigerians really lost this election, especially when it comes to Peter Obi. But by the same token also, I strongly believe, like I stated earlier, I strongly believe and still believe that Bola Tinubu won this election. He might not be the right choice for the people of Nigeria, which I strongly believe that he's not the right choice for the people of Nigeria. He's not the right choice. Because I personally believe Peter Obi would have been the better choice for Nigeria. But based on the analysis, everything that I have looked at, and everything that most people have come to look at right now, you can understand why Bola Tinubu won this election. This election was not rigged. He won this election because of the splitting of votes of Labour, PDP, and NNPP. That is what gave Bola Tinubu the opportunity to win this election. So he won the election. But was he the right choice? I don't think it was the right choice for the people of Nigeria. I think the right choice of the people of Nigeria would have changed the level of corruption, the level of graft, and put in place real democratic systems for the people of Nigeria to benefit for decades and decades to come would have been Peter Obi. I think he would have been a better presidential choice for Nigeria and the continent of Africa as a whole. But unfortunately, because like I stated earlier, because of that splitting of votes among the other three parties, NNPP, PDP, and Labour, that gave Bola Tinubu the opportunity to win this election. That does not take away that Bola Tinubu won this election fairly. And that is what I believe. And I strongly believe that, and I strongly stand by my own analysis, and I strongly stand by it. Because Bola Tinubu won this election hands down because of that. But this notion that somehow it was the will of God for the Bola Tinubu to be elected as president of Nigeria, I mean, please cut it out. We should stop this nonsense. It's about time we start focusing on what the problems that we have in our various African countries are and finding solutions to these problems rather than attributing everything that goes on to be God's will. So we have bad roads, we have bad governance, we don't have hospitals, bad social amenities for our citizens. Somehow it has to be the will of God. No, let's stop using God's name in vain and rather attribute our own problems and solutions to our problems through our own works and our own way of building our societies to suit our environment and to create an environment where people will become more developed, where people will be able to access social amenities and build our various African countries to become a good place for Africans to enjoy life, just like every continent on this planet today. And let's stop using God's name in vain and attributing everything that goes on in Africa as being the will of God. Yes, God loves Africa. That's why he gave us that beautiful weather. That's why he gave us the best continent on earth. But it is up to us, the people of Africa, to use what God has given us to develop our systems, build our countries, and make it better for our fellow citizens. And we should not use God's name in vain just because we didn't like something and we want to accept something else and all that stuff. Let's leave God out of it. The Nigerian elections result was not the will of God. It was the will of the people of Nigeria. So thank you, fellows. If it's Sunday, it's the African Weekly Talk. God bless you guys, and I'll see you guys next Sunday. Peace and love, and take care.